this is right, and usually it's not loud enough, but I'm afraid maybe it's too loud. I don't want to be too loud. Thank you, Jamil, for your comments, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here and honor. It's a beautiful university. I'd never visited it before. It's very impressive. And, well, I'll tell you a little story about, I'm glad to hear that I'm following Jonathan Brown, one of our fine students who came here last week. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Toronto giving a talk, and guess who had been in Toronto the week before? So sometimes we are better known because of our students than because of our own work. Okay, what I want to talk about today is related to the subject of my recent book on Islam's origins. And so at the beginning, if you've read that, some of you may have looked at it or read it, the first couple of pages here will sound very familiar because I'm sort of summarizing some of the ideas from that, but then I go on to new things. So you don't have to leave right away. You hear that it's old hat for you. During its first 2 centuries, roughly the 7th to 8th centuries of the Common Era, the followers of Muhammad established an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia. And they developed both a full array of political institutions and a noteworthy tradition of statecraft. In my remarks today, I want to explore briefly the development of the terminology that was used to describe these imperial institutions and concepts of statecraft. The evolution of early Islamic political terminology is of special importance historically because it reflects a fundamental shift in the way members of the early community thought about themselves. The process represents, in effect, what we might term the Islamization of the state, and it bears heavy implications both for our understanding of Islam's early history and for how modern thinkers, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, interpret the political content of the Islamic tradition, which I'm sure you will all agree is a matter of no mean significance in an age such as this one, when there's a lot of talk about how Islam and Western political values are kind of diametrically opposed. Islamic tradition, of course, presents Muhammad as having established Islam as we know it already during his own lifetime, in complete form and in all its details. There's good reason to believe, however, that in fact Muhammad began not a new religion or a new religious confession, but rather a monotheistic revival movement. According to this view, the community Muhammad founded and the movement he started was open to and included as members pious monotheists of all kinds. It embraced those who followed Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran, to be sure, but it also included righteous monotheists of other kinds, such as Jews and Christians, who shared a belief in the need to live in observant obedience to God's law, as enshrined in their scriptures, the Torah and the Gospels. While some Quranic verses suggest that righteous Christians and Jews were to be counted among those who would attain salvation, the most obvious bit of textual evidence for this inclusion of Jews, at least, in Muhammad's new community is found in the Sahifa document, or the Constitution of Medina, as it's sometimes called. This document states clearly that various Jewish groups of Yathrib, the city that becomes known as Medina, constituted part of the Ummah, or new community, established by Muhammad. This monotheistic revival movement we can best call the believers' movement, because its adherents seem to have referred to themselves as believers. Mu'minun is the Arabic word. We see this usage clearly in the Quran, which is the first text that provides us with reliable information about the thought world of the early community. The word mu'min, believer, or others related to it, such as the phrase, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, is used almost 1,000 times in the Quran and is clearly the term designating those to whom the Quran is addressed, its original audience. No other term is used nearly as frequently as mu'min is. Muslim, for example, and related words occur fewer than 100 times in the Quran, more or less 40, I think, something like that. After the death of Muhammad in 632, the believers' movement was headed by a series of leaders who were called Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the believers. They were the ones who organized the rapid expansion of a new state organized by the believers throughout the Near East and the first creation of an empire. After perhaps 75 years or a century, however, this more open understanding of the nature of the community founded by the prophet, that is open to Christians and Jews as well as to Quranic believers, we might say, this more open understanding of the nature of the community founded by the prophet began to be replaced by a narrower sense of community, according to which only those who followed Quranic law really qualified as believers. This change in self-conception was accompanied by a shift in terminology, whereby the Quranic terms Islam and Muslim were elevated to become the primary designators of this new religious confession and its adherents. Only after this shift in understanding had begun, that is, after about the year 700 of Common Era, were the new conceptions and terms projected back onto the beginnings of the movement, so that Muhammad and his companions retrospectively were considered to be, like their eventual successors, also Muslims in the later sense of the word. This change took hold rather slowly and unevenly, however, and there's ample evidence that the earlier symbiosis in the operation of the empire between Muslims and non-Muslims, to use the later terminology, survived well into the second Muslim or 8th Common Era century. For example, we read in numerous sources, particularly Christian sources of the late 7th and early 8th centuries, of Christians or Zoroastrians who served as tax collectors or other officials of the Islamic State, some even in high positions, such as the famous St. John of Damascus, as he's called in the Christian tradition, who was what we might today call prime minister in the administration of the Umayyad rulers between about 685 and 725. This shift in terminology, then, from believers to Muslims is part of a broader process by which Islam, as we know it, was crystallizing out of the matrix of the earlier believers' movement. The hallmarks of this process were an increased emphasis on the status of Muhammad as prophet and an increased emphasis on the Quran as the final and most perfect revelation of God's word. It is not that Muhammad and the Quran were not known in the earlier believerish phase of the movement, although the absence of robust documentation for this earliest phase in the community's development makes certainty on this question, as on most others, beyond our grasp. But it may be that Muhammad and the Quran were known, but shall we say taken for granted and considered unremarkable amongst the earliest believers. It was just part of the landscape. The Quran may have been for them simply one of several authoritative sources of spiritual guidance. The Quran itself talks about the Torah and the Injil, after all, as valid sources of guidance. Similarly, the earliest believers' memories of Muhammad's role as social and political leader of his community may have masked for a time his more unique status as prophet, as unique recipient of God's word, or conduit for God's word. Whatever the case may be, and of course I'm speculating to some extent when I make those comments because we don't really have the kind of firm documentary evidence that would allow us to prove it decisively one way or another. Whatever the case may be, we can observe that in the Quran and in the earliest surviving documents, the emphasis is clearly on the importance of God and on God's unity. Muhammad is scarcely mentioned in the Quran, whereas God is ever present. And the earliest coins follow closely the designs of Byzantine and Sasanian coins, with the addition only of short slogans such as "in the name of God" or "there is no God but God who has no associate." The first known coin, and we have actually thousands of coins from the early Muslim Empire, the first known coin bearing the name of Muhammad, on the other hand, was minted more than half a century after Muhammad's death in the year 66. From then on, in contrast, the emphasis on Muhammad as God's apostle or the prophet becomes increasingly common in coins, and we more and more frequently see quotes recognizably drawn from the Quran. So sometime around the end of the first Muslim century, or around the year 700, we start to see an increased focus on the prophet's name being mentioned, his status as prophet being mentioned, and the text of the Quran being used as some kind of validation of the coin, or projection of some kind of set of concepts that are drawn from the Quran itself. The increased emphasis on these two notions, then, Muhammad as God's prophet and the Quran as God's revelation, clearly and decisively distinguish Quranic believers from other monotheists who had formerly been part of the believers' movement, particularly from Christians and Jews. This shift was taking place just as the Quranic believers themselves were becoming known as Muslims. Part of this process was an apparently intentional program of relabeling, or maybe you could say rebranding, established institutions of the state. The Umayyad rulers and their entourage, as those in charge of what we can now call the Islamic Empire, seem to have applied terminology derived from the Quran to key institutions and concepts that had developed in the earlier believerish phase of the empire's rise. Their object in doing so was to legitimize their state and their rule over the state in terms of God's revealed word, a policy we can call Quranicization. It seems unlikely, moreover, that the process, once inaugurated by the Umayyads, was continued even after their downfall by the pious and others who wished to redefine the origins of their community as much as possible in terms that had by then become recognized as distinctively Islamic. So once this process gets going, it tends to be carried on even after the Umayyads fall. Everybody wants to then legitimize what they do and what they say in terms of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. In the remainder of my remarks today, I want to discuss briefly a number of key terms and concepts that form part of this shift in terminology. As we shall see, one of the main challenges we face in tracing this process of Quranicization is to determine just when a particular term came into use and in just what meaning, since the copious traditions about the first century or so of the Islamic community found in later narrative sources frequently engage in back projection of later terms, which they interject into the earlier historical contexts, in which those terms may not yet have been used, or in which they may have been used with a different meaning from the one that they later acquired. This back projection process, of course, then masks the shift from an early to a later, more Quranicized terminology, makes it hard to see. It's only by examining, in particular, the contemporary documentary sources for the early community, that is to say, actual physical copies of things that were written by the believers themselves or by people who interacted with the believers and were writing about them. And we have not a literary copy, but something which they actually produced themselves, like a coin or a papyrus document. Only by looking at such authentic early documents that we can hope to see such shifts in terminology. Because the change in terminology would not have taken place in those early documents. We can see what the older terminology was. So let me start with a few examples of this process. Perhaps the most obvious case and the most easily grasped case of Quranicization, and maybe among the most important, involves the terminology applied to the head of state. As already noted, the head of the believers' movement was from the beginning called Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the believers. Well, this is a very nice title from my point of view because it captures nicely both the early movement's self-conception or self-definition as a community of believers. He's the commander of the believers. And it includes the idea that the one leading this movement had powers resembling those of a military commander or emir. The inscriptions and papyri and other truly documentary sources from the 7th century that refer to this personage, which number now maybe 24 or more, so we're getting quite a good corpus here of material, they all invariably refer to him as Amir al-Mu'mineen, without exception, commander of the believers. Also, non-Muslim sources dating to the 7th or early 8th century affirm this titulature. Byzantine texts in Greek, when they begin to refer to the ruler of the rival state, refer to him as Amir al-Mu'min in Greek, clearly an effort to transliterate or transcribe the Arabic Amir al-Mu'mineen into Greek. And there are Christian texts in Syriac which call him Amir al-Muhaymane, which is kind of a semi-translation. Amir is obviously Amir as in Arabic, and Muhaymane is the Syriac equivalent of the word mu'min, believer, or believers. Even the Frankish pilgrim Willibald, who toured the Middle East early part of the 8th century and wrote in the 720s, spoke of, quote, the Saracen king whose name was Mirmumnus. So we have another garbled version of the same title. And this term even shows up actually in Chinese annals as early as the 650s. I won't give you the Chinese equivalent. I don't have it, and I wouldn't be able to pronounce it if I did. So I don't think there can be any doubt, really, that the term Amir al-Mu'mineen was the primary and probably, indeed, almost certainly the exclusive term used to designate the leader of the community of believers in the 7th century. And yet, towards the end of the 7th century, the Umayyad Amir al-Mu'mineen, Abdul Malik, who ruled from 685 to 705, began to issue coinage, where he refers to himself using a new term, which is Khalifa. Actually, he uses the phrase Khalifatullah, which is a Quranic phrase. It's anglicized, of course, as caliph, and we always talk about the caliphs of the early Islamic period. Well, Khalifa means a variety of things: representative, lieutenant, someone sort of holding a command in place of somebody else when he's away, sometimes a successor, and so on. And Abdul Malik and his advisors evidently favored this new term, Khalifa, because Amir al-Mu'mineen, although it was long established and well understood by everyone, is not a term found in the Quran. So for them, maybe this was a problem. They were ruling this empire. They wanted to make sure that people understood that this empire was rooted in the Quran and the Prophet's mission, and so they went back to the Quran and found this word Khalifa, which they picked out of it, and they applied it to Abdul Malik. This term does appear in the Quran, and it seems likely that's why Abdul Malik and his advisors chose to use it. In the Quran, the term Khalifa appears only a few times, and its sense is a little bit vague. But what's important about it, I think, is the fact that it occurs in a phrase that suggests some kind of special relationship with divine authority. The phrase is Khalifatullah, God's Khalifa. And it's exactly in this form, Khalifatullah, that the term Khalifa first appears on the coins of Abdul Malik as a designation for himself, the ruler. This represents then, I think, a clear case of Quranicization, that is, where Abdul Malik, as the ruler, attempted to link the established office of head of state, which he held and which was called Amir al-Mu'mineen, with the Quran and hence with divine authority by renaming it using this Quranic word, Khalifa. The Umayyads' effort to replace the older term did not succeed at once, for the term Amir al-Mu'mineen continued to use for many centuries alongside Khalifa as a designation for the ruler. But what's interesting is that later Muslim chroniclers favored the new terminology and somewhat misleadingly, I think, applied it retrospectively to Abdul Malik's predecessors all the way back, basically to the first of them, all of whom they call anachronistically caliphs or khulafa. The position of the head of the Islamic State, we can say, had by the time of the later Muslim chroniclers been terminologically and conceptually Quranicized. It was this later application of the term Khalifa to early heads of state that misled some scholars to claim that the term Khalifa was also in use in this way very early on. But I think the silence of the documentary sources on this point, all of which, as I said, use Amir al-Mu'mineen, is quite deafening. If we had only one or two coins or inscriptions that talked about the Amir al-Mu'mineen, it might be one thing, but as I say, we have a couple dozen now. And in different kinds of evidence, we have a number of inscriptions from Muawiyah that call him Amir al-Mu'mineen in stone. We also have a number of papyri that use this term. Okay, so that's one example, and I think, as I say, the clearest maybe example of this process of Quranicization and what may have driven it. More fundamental, but harder to trace, is a change that I've already referred to, that is, that refers to communal identity and communal boundaries in a more general sense. That's the shift in terminology from believers, mu'minun or mu'mineen, to Muslims, muslimun, as the main way of referring to members of the community or to the nature of the community itself. With this change came a narrowing of the boundaries of the community to include only the Quranic believers, as we might call them, so that those Christian and Jewish believers of the earlier years, who had hitherto been part of the believers' movement, were, with this action, so to speak, defined out of the movement. This change was paralleled by an increased use of, or emphasis on, the very word Islam as the designation for the movement itself. But we have more difficulty tracing this change in terminology. It's not as easy as with Amir al-Mu'minin and Khalifa, because our evidence is, shall we say, messier. For one thing, both the terms believer and the words Muslim and Islam are found in the Quran, and sometimes, rarely, used in early documentary texts. So it becomes important to establish as securely as possible exactly what these terms meant in the particular texts in which they are used, and to see if they evolved in meaning over time. And this is always tricky when you're dealing, as we are in this case, with texts that are very limited in number, insecurely dated, and often fragmentary and poorly preserved and poorly contextualized. Some passages in the Quran suggest that the word Muslim originally referred essentially to outward, perhaps merely political submission to the community, whereas Iman, belief, and Mu'min, believers, referred to a more spiritual or inner acceptance of the ideas of monotheism and of Muhammad's prophecy, or something of this kind, and also to a commitment to live righteously in the community in accordance with the stringent dictates of God's revealed law. Most striking in this regard is Quran 49:14, which reads, talking about the Bedouins, al-Arab, says, the Bedouins, al-Arab, have said, Amanna, we believe. Say to them, you do not believe. Rather say, Aslamna, we have submitted. For belief, Iman, has not yet entered your hearts. Well, this seems to make it clear that these Bedouins were not considered to be truly believers, and they were enjoined to simply call themselves Muslims, I guess we would say. They would say, Aslamna, we have submitted. As we've seen, the early community seems to have included some Christians and Jews among the believers, and the preliminary evidence suggests that the shift to Islam, as we know it right up until today, begins in the last quarter of the first Islamic century, or the end of the 7th century, just at the time the Umayyad rulers are beginning to call themselves caliphs. So it looks like there's a kind of collective process here with different things going on. The evidence for this shift includes such documents as the interior inscriptions of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which was built in the 690s, which criticized the concept of the Trinity in such a way as to draw a clear line between Christians, or at least Trinitarian Christians, which is most of them, and the core of the believers' community. It seems quite obvious from those phrases that you cannot be a Trinitarian Christian and also claim to be a believer. And it's also around this time that we begin to see an increased textual emphasis on the significance of Muhammad's prophetic mission. Tracing this set of shifts is also difficult, however, because the later Muslim community was intent on disguising the fact that their community began as a believers' movement, with a broader, more inclusive sense of membership that eventually came to prevail once the community had redefined itself as a community of Muslims, that is, once Christians and Jews in particular, and maybe other non-Quranic monotheists, had been kind of defined out of the movement. Following the period of redefinition and the coalescence of their identity as Muslims in the late 7th century and early 8th century, Common Era, the community produced in the 8th and later centuries a veritable flood of reports that projected the later understanding of their Muslim identity back to the very origins of the believers' movement. This effort included many reports that attempt to equate the meanings of the terms believer and Muslim, even though the Quran text itself, the one I just read for you, shows them to mean different things. They may be related in meaning, but they obviously, from that Quranic passage, at the time of the Quran anyway, did not have exactly the same meaning. Later, Muslims also employed other stratagems designed to persuade everyone that Islam, as understood in their day, went right back to the time of the Prophet and sprang completely in all its details from his teaching. So there's a kind of effort to project this somewhat later understanding back to the beginnings. Another arena where we might trace something of a shift in terminology, I think, is in the arena of terminology used for foreign warfare. The Quran uses the term jihad, which essentially means striving or exerting oneself in a whole variety of ways, ranging from one's inner struggle against sinful desires, to violent struggle against unbelievers who attack the believers, to the need to do good in your community and to sort of work for that as a kind of proactive attitude. In the Quran, jihad appears especially in the phrase jihad fi sabilillah, striving in the way of God. The word jihad became very prominent in the Muslim juridical literature of the Second Islamic century or the 8th century Common Era, and later, particularly in the sense of holy war, that is, war directed against non-Muslim states or non-Muslim communities. Indeed, it came to be associated specifically with the military campaigns organized by the caliphs, as they come to be called, against the Islamic State's external enemies. Islamic legal texts of this and later periods, that is 8th century on, usually present jihad as a duty incumbent on the community as a whole, rather than a duty incumbent on each individual Muslim. This might be understood in two ways, at least. On the one hand, it could be clearly understood as relieving individual Muslims of the duty of undertaking jihad, as long as the caliph is actively pursuing jihad on their behalf, or on behalf of the community. On the other hand, it might be considered as tantamount to making conduct of jihad a monopoly of the state, in effect barring individual Muslims from launching jihad warfare on their own initiative without the sanction of their rulers, something that you might well imagine the rulers would want to do. They don't want people sort of, when they've made a truce with the Byzantines, say they don't want some hothead on the border going off and creating a problem for them. Well, much remains to be clarified about the historical evolution of many things, including the meaning of the word jihad. But it is clear that these later understandings of jihad differ significantly from the meaning it seems to have in the Quran, where the word is addressed especially to individuals, as is the whole Quran, actually. It is addressed to you and to me. We read it, and we're supposed to take the message to heart individually. So it's addressed to individuals in the Quran, and it embraces a wide variety of actions, among which fighting or violent coercion is only one option. This appears to be, to me anyway, another example of Quranicization, whereby the Quranic word jihad came to be applied as a standard term to warfare against non-believers that had earlier been described originally using other terms, perhaps, such as qital, fighting, or ghazwa, raiding. But again, we need more documentary evidence, if we can find it and dig it up somewhere, to really test this hypothesis out. It does seem, however, that in this instance, we see the purveyors of Islamic law in the 8th and 9th centuries taking a term that in the Quran seems to impinge upon the individual believer and applying it to the state, even though the concept of the state or any specific guidance on governance is almost entirely absent from the Quran. So it's really been plucked out of its Quranic context and applied in a really wholly different context. Another example that we might see has to do with what we can call the judiciary. Like any state, the empire erected by the early believers was faced with disputes among members of its own community, and it seems likely that the early Amir al-Mu'mineen took such issues seriously in view of the main goal of the believers' movement, which, as I understand it, was to vanquish iniquity and establish a righteous and therefore presumably just public order in preparation for the Last Judgment. I mean, it was important that the community that life be conducted in a righteous way so that the believers could attain salvation. Papyrus documents from the first Islamic century, 7th century Common Era, describe cases in which provincial governors or the village headmen, who often served as their subordinates, were called upon to settle civil complaints. Sometime in the 8th century, however, we begin to find a new designation for the person responsible for passing judgments. And that term is qadi, which of course in Arabic, rather till today, means judge. The word qadi occurs only once in the Quran, in the sense of one who decides something. It's kind of generic. It isn't an office yet, obviously. But the related verb, qada, occurs many times in the Quran. So the later use of the term qadi, I think, would very likely have evoked echoes of Quranic discourse in the minds and ears of those who heard it. So this, we might suggest, is another case in which an existing political institution or practice is Quranicized, that is, relabeled or rebranded with terminology drawn from the Quran as a way of enhancing the state's claim to Islamic legitimacy. They're saying this institution and this officer is, he has some kind of Quranic warrant, you might say. In this case, the ruler seems to have initiated a new position or office, designated by the term qadi, to handle judicial procedures that heretofore had been parts of the duties of a governor or of his subordinates. And it is striking that we do have thousands of papyri and papyrus fragments from the first Islamic century from Egypt. Now, many of them don't deal with questions of civil disputes of any kind, but there are some that do, and not a single one of them uses this word qadi. It just doesn't appear in the earliest papyri. Another example, which I think is quite interesting, is the question of what we can call the Islamic era and the Islamic calendar. The dating era that we usually call the Islamic era or the Hijra era, beginning in the year 622, the Common Era, seems also to be a case where we see an effort to project Islamic values back to the beginning of the Believers' Movement through creative renaming. For the historian, there are two very striking facts about this era or dating system. The first fact is that we find it already in place at a very early time in the history of the community. That is, this era we have very early documents that talk about things in this era. There are quite a number of actual documents from the first century, Islamic century, that provide an exact date, at least a year anyway, as part of the document's text. And these include papyri and inscriptions, and above all, thousands of coins minted by the leaders of the Believers' Movement or by their subordinates, their governors in various areas. Some of these documents are astonishingly early, including some early papyri dating to the year 22. It's the earliest one we have so far. Now, that's really early. That would be 644 Common Era or thereabouts. This fact obviously has very important implications for our understanding of the nature of the early Believers' Movement. In recent years, some scholars have argued that Islam first emerged as the consequence not of an organized movement of some kind, but as a result of a series of fortuitous accidents: the collapse of the great empires, Byzantine and Sasanian, the conquests of part of those empires' territory by uncoordinated tribes of Arabian nomads, and so on. What I call the accidental thesis. So the empire kind of came to be as a result of a bunch of accidents. But I think it is difficult to defend the idea that the expansion of what we think of as Muhammad's community was some kind of accident. That is, that it was the consequence of a haphazard series of unrelated events in light of the existence of a general ideology underlying the movement. In light of the existence of a uniform system of dating, which implies that there was some kind of general ideology underlying the movement. The mere existence of a single new dating system does not tell us what this ideology may have been. Perhaps it was related to apocalypticism, which often causes people to start a new era, as it did with the French Revolution, we might say. But it does support the contention that the expansion was the result of some kind of coordinated movement, whatever it may have been. The second striking fact about this era or dating system, however, is really just as revealing for the historian. It is that most of the early datings provide only the year, or the day, month, and year, but do not provide the name of the era itself. That is, a document will say something like, this was written in the year 55, without any indication of the era. Year 55 of what? They don't tell you. Later Islamic tradition, of course, claims that these dates are in what we usually call the Hijra era. That is, that the era commemorates the Prophet Muhammad's Hijra or immigration from Mecca to Medina in 622. This event marked the moment when the Believers' Movement first assumed the status of an autonomous political community, and would indeed be a very appropriate starting point for the community of believers dating system. They could say, well, we really begin as a community when Muhammad comes to Medina, so we'll start our calendar with that. But the fact remains that none of the early documents, not a single one, uses the term Hijra to designate the era. The first one that uses the word Hijra is sometime maybe around 300. But very few documents, however, do designate the era, but using another term. There's a papyrus in the Louvre, and a couple of others in Vienna, that refer to, quote, the year 42 min qada al-mu'minin, in the jurisdiction of the believers. Now, this provides us with further confirmation, one, that the members of the community founded by Muhammad at first thought of themselves as believers, because they talk about themselves as being, their rule as being qada, meaning the jurisdiction of the believers. And of course, they're led by the commander of the believers, so that seems to be pretty secure now. It also suggests that for a half century, at least, they viewed their government as being a manifestation, an application of this concept of righteous belief. But the question then becomes, when did the association of this era with the Hijra, rather than with the believers movement, begin? One simply does not find the terms years of the Hijra used in documents from the first Hijra century. So as I say, it seems to be only much later that this term is used, probably around 300 in the Hijra era or later, so this is 9th, 10th century already. It seems then that in this case too, we have an example of a later attempt to associate a well-established practice, the practice of dating, with the Prophet Muhammad through his hijrah. This is less Quranicization than propheticization, I guess we can say, but there's an effort to link it very clearly with these dual legitimizing forces, the Prophet and the Quran. Renaming the era in this way enhanced the legitimacy of the practice itself and of the community and state that was associated with the practice in terms that could be seen as Islamic, tied to the Prophet and the Quran. But in this case, perhaps just as important, was the fact that naming helped to efface the memory of the more ecumenical nature of the early community as a believers' movement, which, as I said later, the later Muslim tradition wanted to kind of forget and have us forget the fact that that was what had happened earlier on. Another interesting terminological case that falls, I think, within this pattern has to do with the terms used for the campaigns to expand the community. In classical Islamic tradition of somewhat later times, 2nd and 3rd centuries of Hijra, and subsequently, the campaigns of expansion of the early community are referred to as futuh, singular as fath, commonly translated as conquest. The thousands of reports about this heroic chapter in the history of the community were collected to form one of the great themes of early Islamic historiography. So if you go into Tabari's chronicle or many others, you'll find extensive reports about the futuhat, as they're called, the conquests. It is not clear, however, what term or terms were actually used to refer to the expansion of the early community of believers, including its conquest or subjugation of cities at the time of the events themselves. The word fath in Arabic, as anybody who studied Arabic will tell you right away, if you ask what does fatah mean, it doesn't mean to conquer, it means to open. Everybody knows that it means to open. And to render the notion of conquest, words derived from other Arabic roots might seem more obvious than something from fatah, some of which are actually used in the Quran, such as the word qahara, to conquer or subdue, or zafara, again, to subdue something. It is noteworthy, however, that in the Quran, the verb fataha with the preposition ala, fataha ala, is sometimes used when God bestows a great favor on someone. It seems then that Islamic traditionists may have adopted this usage in coining the term that they use to designate the expansion of the community into new areas, the conquest of a city, for example. The individual moments of which, or of this conquest, such as the defeat of an enemy or the incorporation of a new town, whether by military or by peaceful means, were termed fath, that is, a kind of grant of God's grace to the community. He gave it to us, reflecting the theological view that these events were an act of grace and evidence of God's favor for the community of believers in its earliest years. This couldn't have happened without God's favor to us. It's a sign that God was on the side of the conquerors. Whatever original words may have been used to discuss the expansion, subsequent Islamic tradition came to favor a Quranically inspired term to refer to it, which again, in this case, has powerful theological implications too, which I think are also important. Let me look over here and see if there's okay. Another case would be the terminology used to describe civil wars in the early years of the community. As you, I'm sure most of you know, there were two major civil wars in early Islamic history. And just as Islamic tradition adopted a Quranic word to refer to the expansion process, so too it turned to the Quran for a designation of the violent struggles that pitted different factions of the ruling elite against one another in the early community in a struggle for leadership. in particular the so-called First and Second Civil Wars, 656 to 660, and then the second one was 680 to 692. In this case, the word chosen was fitna, which in the Quran and in Arabic generally means temptation, seduction, and enticement, primarily of the worldly kind. It can mean sexual temptation or seduction, or it can mean the temptation posed by worldly goods, wealth, whatever it might be, or power. Again, not otherworldly concerns. In other words, the idea is that what makes it a fitna is that it's something seductive in this world, rather than having you be mindful of the other world to come. It keeps you focused on benefits in this world. Again, as with futuh, it is not known what terms, if any, were used by the actual participants in the early civil wars to refer to those events or to the motivations of various actors in them. The Quranic word fitna, however, conveyed unequivocally the sentiment of traditionists of somewhat later time, for whom the open struggles for power among companions of the Prophet posed something of a theological problem. By their time, in the 8th century and later, the doctrine that all the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, people, the Sahaba who had known him, were essentially paragons of virtue, had come to prevail. And so open fighting among them could only be seen as a real problem, and could be most gracefully explained away perhaps by arguing that one or another companion had succumbed to the temptations of the world. Like the word futuh, fitna became one of the main themes of classical Islamic historiography. In both of these two cases, futuh and fitna, obviously we have to be, those who work with the papyri and other documents from the first century of the Islamic era really need to constantly be paying close attention to the terms that are used for things to see, do they ever use these terms? Or are they talking about things that later would be referred to by these terms, but they're using another term? That would really be nice evidence to find, but we don't have enough, we haven't looked at the documents closely enough yet, and we don't have enough of them to say we have some evidence that really bears on that question. Well, there are other examples. I have another example on the term for frontier outposts, which I think is another case where a Quranic term is used to refer to something for reasons that, to help legitimize the practice, but I think I can stop with that as examples and sum up, because I think these examples provide sufficient evidence that we can begin to see a pattern. Once those who followed the Quran had decided that they, and only they, were truly believers, sometime around the year 700 and thereafter, they began to rename key institutions and practices of the empire and of the community that their predecessors in the believers movement had created, so as to link them to the Quran and to the Prophet Muhammad, whom they considered to have been the vehicle of the Quran's revelation. In doing so, they were simply attempting to construct a strong basis for religious legitimation of their government, something they tried to do also in other ways, such as by fostering the collection of historical traditions about the life of the Prophet Muhammad and his early community, or by constructing major buildings at important religious sites, such as Abdul Malik's Dome of the Rock or the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But in the process of redefining themselves in this way, they also did something more, and I think they did it deliberately. They suppressed or buried or reinterpreted out of existence almost all evidence that the movement originally started by Muhammad had been a more open believers movement than later Islam would be. Where Islam became focused exclusively on Muhammad and the Quran, the believers movement that preceded it had involved close association and cooperation with righteous non-Quranic monotheists, particularly, I think, with Christian and Jewish believers, with whom they had joined forces to bring to the world what they thought was a properly righteous and God-fearing way of life, enshrined in a stable and protective political order. This policy of Quranicization was thus one important part of the process by which the community founded by Muhammad was gradually transformed from a community of believers into a community of Muslims. It was, however, a process that, while first set in motion by the Umayyads as rulers of the first Islamic state, continued after their fall from power in 750. The practice of Quranicization had by then evidently acquired a momentum of its own. For subsequent generations of Muslims, in particular their intellectual and religious elites, saw, as well as had the Umayyads, that it was important to legitimize their community and its institutions in ways that linked them to the Quran and the career of the Prophet Muhammad. The result was that much of the classical Islamic discourse about Islam's origins became cloaked in a veil of Quranic vocabulary that often obscures the realities of the early believers' movement. To peer behind this veil, we must search diligently for further scraps of documentary evidence that might tell us how things looked before the process of Quranicization really took hold. Thank you very much.